Thank you, Morgan. Can you hear me okay?
All good. Sounds
Excellent. Thank you. So welcome everyone, and I appreciate everyone joining me today to talk about my favorite thing to talk about, which is birds. My name is Colleen Bocon. I have been a member of Wake Audubon for several years now, and I currently work as the Outdoor Education and Parks Manager with the town of Garner at White Deer Park and Lake Benson. So I'm fortunate enough to actually get paid to go bird watching and do fun things like teach y'all more about bird identification and what Wake Audubon does. So today, at Morgan's request, I'm going to cover some of the common birds that we see throughout the North Carolina Piedmont. So whether you are based in Harnett County or Johnston County like me, or Wake County, or somewhere else close by, all of these birds should be fairly common to your backyard and other locations that you visit. And most, if not all, of the birds in the presentation will be year-round species. So I try to start out with our year-round species so that you can get lots of practice seeing these birds throughout the year. And we'll talk a little bit about the few that might be the exception to that rule. After we talk a little bit about common birds and how to identify them, I'll cover what Wake Audubon does as an organization and give you some more information on how you can become involved or at least take advantage of some of the great events and resources that we have available. So let's get into it. So I like to always start off with some general identification tips that are really good to know. So whether you've been bird watching for a while, or maybe you're thinking about getting started or have sort of consider yourself a beginner, there are some things to sort of keep in mind as you go around searching for birds that will really make it easier for you to start to identify them by species. So the first thing is your general impression of the bird. So the longer you bird watch and look up birds, you'll start to get a sense of the small birds versus the large birds. And so your general first impression of a bird is going to give you a lot of information. So of course you're going to see size, whether it's a large bird, a really small bird, somewhere in between, and then also things like shape. And this can be the overall shape of the bird itself. So things like long-bodied, short-bodied, is it rounder, is it sleeker? And then also different shapes for beaks, heads, tails. So there's a lot of things that can go into just the shape. And then also movement. So you have birds that can be really fast and sort of flit around the trees, or you can have birds like ducks that are sort of gliding across the water. So how a bird moves is going to give you a lot of information about what potential species it might be as well. Now, getting into more detail, as you look at a bird, you're going to look for things called field marks. And these are going to be colors or stripes, spots, streaks that you notice when you see the bird. And sometimes you might only see a bird for 3 to 5 seconds as it flies by. So really training your eye to pick up on different field marks is really helpful to sort of start to figure out, okay, what did I just see? So looking at the birds we have above in that kind of line of photos, you can see on the far left, we have some large flying birds that are mostly white with black wingtips. Then we have sort of a large wading bird, and right away I see this blue stripe on the head where it's mostly white, but then there's a nice blue stripe through the eye area. Moving to the next one, we've got a sparrow, and sparrows can be tricky, but this one has a nice cluster of black that almost looks like a bullseye in the middle of its chest. And that's actually the field mark for the song sparrow, which is what that is. And then on the far right, we have a beautiful, brilliant yellow bird, and it's yellow all over with a little bit of dark edging on the wing and tail. So all of these are field marks, and these are sort of the clues that we use to get to species. Now, after a while, if you're getting comfortable with what you're seeing, you can also pay attention to the sounds that birds make. And I will be the first to admit that I am a way above average eye birder and a below average ear birder. So my brain can only hold on to so many bird songs and calls at any given time. And I've realized that as much as I practice, I just don't have an ear to pick up a lot of calls and be able to memorize them. However, I know a lot of people who are amazing at this, and they can basically pick out every little chip and peep in the woods and tell you exactly what that bird is, which still blows my mind to this day. So don't get overwhelmed, but you can learn a lot about out sounds and calls. And for a lot of these year-round species, you might get to pick up 10, 15, 20, and then you can sort of build from there. Now, all birds have what we call calls, which tend to be 1 or 2 notes. Then they have songs, which are much more complicated. And so typically these are what we're hearing in the spring when the males are trying to impress the females. And then there's also a fair number of birds that make sounds from their wing beats or other movements. So for example, we have mourning doves, and they tend to make kind of a funny whistling noise when they lift off. So they may not be calling, but you're actually hearing the sound from their wings. But that could be another identifying characteristic that you can use. So fourth is habitat and where that bird is located within a habitat. So for example, we know we're going to find ducks for the most part out in open water. Now it could be a lake, a pond, the ocean. We know we have wood ducks. So these guys can be found in swamps and areas that have a lot of trees, but they're not going to stray too far from some sort of water source. And then on the flip side, you have birds that we're only going to find deep in a forest. And so once you get to know the habitats where birds are located, that helps you narrow down those options when you're trying to figure out exactly what species you're looking for. So not just the type of habitat it's found in, but where. So we can go as far as to say there are certain birds that love to be at the very tops of trees almost all the time. So for example, that bird on the far right is a summer tanager. They love to be way up in the treetops, so it's super hard to get a really good look at them. And then we have other birds that like to sort of be in the mid-story, and other birds that like to be in low sort of shrubby areas, and even ones that spend most of their time on the ground. Finally, you can look at behaviors. So kind of putting all of those other pieces together. If you see a species of bird often enough, you'll start to pick up on their behaviors. So these are things like, what is their feeding style? Are they digging around on the ground with their feet? Are they flipping over leaves with their beak? Maybe they move really fast throughout a shrub versus sitting in one place. And so I'll mention some of these behaviors throughout the presentation that actually help to figure out some of the species that I've decided to choose for us today. So again, these are all things to sort of keep in mind as you're bird watching. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my clicker. There we go. All right, so I wanted to start off with our state bird. So this is one that hopefully everyone has seen at least once or twice. This is our northern cardinal. And this is a great example of sexual dimorphism. So not all birds are sexually dimorphic, which means the male and the female have very distinct plumage patterns. A lot of them do look exactly the same, and we're going to see some examples of that as well. But the northern cardinal is a great bird to sort of see this male versus female. So typically female birds tend to be drabber, and the main reason for this is because they need to be camouflaged in the nest. So this helps to protect those eggs and chicks, since in most bird species the female is spending the majority of the time in the nest taking care of those babies. So it's not really helpful to be a really bright color so that you're attracting more predators. The male, however, on the flip side, is really this beautiful, brilliant red with a little black mask. And so typically the male birds are colored so that they're attracting those females. They want to get all of that attention and make sure that they're passing along their genetics to the next generation. But if you can look at some of these field characteristics in size and shape, these tend to be sort of medium to small birds, and something they're known for are those peaks, sort of that triangular head. And you see that in both the male and the female. And again, that brilliant sort of deep red color and the black mask on the male. And then the female has sort of little hints of a reddish orange color on her peak, her wings, and her tail. And then they both have these really amazing orange beaks, which is fairly unusual for birds. Typically birds have pink or black or brown bills, and they just have this really pretty orange bill instead. And you'll also notice it's a very triangular shaped bill. So this sort of gives you the clue that they are primarily seed eaters, and they have those really strong, hefty bills in order to crack open seeds and other things. Next, we have a couple of cute little birds that like to travel together. So I call them the Birdy Buddies because almost always if you see or hear one of these, you're going to hear or see the other. So this is our Carolina chickadee and tufted titmouse. These are very small birds, some of the smallest birds that we're going to see at the feeders or in the woods. On the left is the tufted titmouse. So like the cardinal, it has that really cute little peak head. And again, it's not always going to have it flared out like that, but you can almost always tell they have a little bit of sort of a peak of some sort on their head, even if it's a little bit rounded. They have a little bit of a black mark that goes above the top of their bill, gray over the back, and a white underneath, but then you kind of see these little streaks of sort of a cinnamon rusty color on the sides. Those aren't always obvious, and that picture there is probably taken during breeding season where that color is really shining through a little bit more than it typically would. And then to the right is its buddy, the Carolina chickadee. And this is, again, you can tell just by looking at them, the Carolina chickadee is a little bit shorter bodied and a little bit rounder than the titmouse. They're also a little bit smaller. So if you saw them side by side, you'd be able to see a size difference between these two species right away. And the Carolina chickadee is always going to be a little bit smaller. They have a very obvious black and white pattern to their head, gray on the back, and then sort of a white to buffy color underneath. The great thing about the chickadee, if you're wanting to start to learn bird calls, is it's one of the species that says its name, which I find very helpful. So if you have this little bird and you're hearing chickadee-dee-dee, you know exactly what you're looking at. The tufted titmouse, on the other hand, says Peter, 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 and has a variety of other sounds it makes along with the Carolina chickadee. But every so often you'll get lucky enough for them to say those two phrases, and you'll be able to tell what they are, even if you don't see them. Next, we have the Carolina wren. This is one of my favorite birds. It is a really small bird with a really big mouth and also a really big attitude. So they're sort of hard to forget. They are pretty common throughout. They're very adapted to human inhabited areas. And as you can see in that little insert picture on the bottom, they're also known for nesting in the most bizarre places. So if you ever end up with a bird nest in a place like your car grill, your mailbox, your actual charcoal grill, a hanging wreath on your porch, chances are it's a Carolina wren. They build really messy nests pretty much anywhere they can think of. And they seem to pick the most unusual places that usually are not very convenient for us. So you sort of have that moment where, okay, can I live with this bird here or not? They are known for making a variety of calls. They tend to have 3 notes in their calls. So they'll do like cheeseburger, 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 or tea kettle, tea kettle, tea kettle, and they're very loud. So even if there's a lot of birds calling, you can almost always make out the Carolina wren because it just tends to have a voice that carries much louder and much further than all of the other species. Looking at its field marks, you can see that it's got a lot of beautiful brown hues, so lots of different tones of brown, but it has this very obvious sort of cream colored eye stripe right above its eye that goes all the way back to its neck. So that's something you're almost always going to be able to pick out, even if it's moving quickly. And then underneath, it has sort of a lighter brown belly and neck. And again, kind of a long skinny tail compared to the rest of the body. And a lot of times it actually holds its tail straight up in the air. And I'm not sure why it does this, but it sort of gives it a little bit more attitude. And sometimes they'll actually twitch it around. So I think they're using their tail to communicate just as much as their mouths. Next, we have the mourning dove. And this one it tends to be overlooked. It's also related to what we call our pigeons or our rock doves. But these are much more diminutive. So they're much smaller and a little bit skinnier overall than our pigeons. And they really have some beautiful colors that are often overlooked. So if you can see that inset picture, it's got this really amazing sort of light teal color ring around its eye, which a lot of times you don't get to see if you don't have these birds close to you. And then you can also start to see a little bit of that iridescence that they have in their feathers, especially throughout their neck and kind of moving down into their breast or stomach region. So again, depending on the lighting, they can be really stunning birds. Overall, these tend to be fairly medium-sized birds, spend a lot of their time on the ground, but they'll also perch up in trees and stay pretty stationary for long periods of time, whether they're alone or in small groups. And as you can see the backs, they have these really pretty patterns of some sort of darker brown feathers with little black dots sort of set in here and there. So I feel like they're really beautiful birds. You just sort of have to look at the details a little bit more than some of these stunning bright red and blue and yellow birds that we like to pay attention to. They have a cooing call, so they're the ones that really sound sad. So when folks don't see their name written out, a lot of times they assume it's mourning dove as in time of the day, because that's when you hear them a lot. But they got their name mourning as in sadness because they sound like they're sort of crying. So here's a bird that a lot of folks love and gets lots of attention and love. So this is our ruby-throated hummingbird. It is possible to see other species of hummingbirds in North Carolina, but this is the one that's actually native to our area and throughout the East Coast and Eastern United States. But every once in a while, we do get what we call vagrant hummingbirds, but folks tend to get pretty excited when that happens, and you usually hear about it. But 99% of the time, if you see a hummingbird, even if you don't see a brilliant red throat, chances are it is probably a ruby-throated hummingbird. So this is another one where the males and females are very different. So the male is that really beautiful one on the left with that gorgeous iridescent red to orange throat. And they flash this to attract the females. And then on the right, we have the female, and you can see they both have sort of a greenish hue on their backs. And a lot of times the males might be a little bit of a deeper, kind of more jewel tone, and the females might be just a little bit more of a drab green color. But typically, if you saw them from behind, just the back part, it'd be kind of hard to tell if you had a male or a female sometimes, especially if it's a juvenile male. Sometimes it takes males a long time to get their full coloration. And sometimes when it's not breeding season, they can be a little bit duller as well. Another difference you can see between the male and the female is that the male has a pretty dark head. So it's almost like a dark cap, but it does extend right underneath the bill as well before you start to get the coloration on the throat. And you can see that the female sort of has a much lighter head, so kind of a greenish brown color. But again, these are our one pollinating bird. So they drink nectar versus most other birds that are eating seeds and insects. What folks don't know, however, is hummingbirds do eat a really high amount of insects and even spiders. So they do get a lot of protein source as well, but they do love their sugar water, whether it's coming out of flowers or our feeders. And if you've ever seen a hummingbird nest, usually it's a lot of moss and lichens. And the way that they hold their nest together is by collecting spider webs and weaving that. They basically use it as a glue to sort of stick all of that material together, which is pretty interesting. So while they're taking the spider's web, a lot of times they're eating the spiders as well. So very efficient. Here's sort of a nondescript bird that you may have seen and possibly overlooked before. This is the eastern phoebe, very common throughout our area, and we do see this year round. They're much more obvious in the spring and the summer, though, because they tend to have territories and they make themselves pretty well known. One of their behaviors is to sit way up on a branch. Ideally, a lot of times it's a branch that doesn't have any leaves on it, so it's sort of open and obvious. And also they may sit way high up on a fence line, and they like to hunt from a perch. So they are mainly insect eaters, so they're insectivores, and they're part of a group called the flycatchers, which can be really difficult to tell apart. They're all sort of small birds that have these grayish, brownish tones and maybe whitish and buffy underneath. And so unless you hear them or you pick up on some of their behaviors, it can be really tough to distinguish between all the different flycatchers. Now, the phoebe is one of our most common, and this is another bird that says its name. So if you see a bird that looks like this and it's saying Phoebe, Phoebe, it's basically telling you what it is. It's brilliant. But we also have a bird called the eastern pewee, and it will say pee-wee, pee-wee. And so it's saying its name as well, slightly different. So you really have to pay attention. The cool thing about the eastern phoebe is when it leaves its perch to kind of fly out and catch insects on the wing, it almost always returns back to that same perch. And so they can be a bit frustrating when you're trying to look at them through binoculars and they're constantly moving away from the spot where you think they're going to sit for a while. But the great thing is if you wait a couple of seconds, they're going to return to that same spot almost all of the time, especially if they're actively feeding. They're going to constantly come back to that same spot or pretty close by. So you sort of can just hang out and wait at that spot and get a little bit of information every time it comes back into view. So another bird that you may have heard before and possibly not seen is the pine warbler. And I like to include this in all of my beginner birding slideshows because I like to remind folks that birding can be frustrating at times and be a little intimidating or overwhelming, but if you spend enough time doing it and you keep practicing, you can overcome anything, I promise. And so one thing about the pine warbler is all 4 of these pictures are the same species. And so some folks will look at these pictures, especially the far right that are above each other. So that top right corner and bottom right or bottom left or bottom right corner, excuse me. If you saw those 2 birds, you'd probably assume that they were different species. Very dramatic differences in coloration. Just the poses make them look a little bit different as far as size and shape. But again, lighting and the way they're sitting will change their appearance a little bit. But again, these are 4 distinct colorations of one bird. So that bottom right corner bird is a female. So again, very drab by comparison. The top right is a male in breeding plumage. So this is as colorful and distinct as this bird is going to get. And then on the left side, we have 2 other variations sort of somewhere in between. So the bottom left is a male outside of breeding season. So you can see those black streaks that are really obvious on the top right are much more muted on the bottom left. And that's just because they tend to molt throughout the year. And so they're losing a lot of those bright colors that they use for breeding, and they get a little bit more subdued during fall and winter. The top left is probably an immature male. So it's just starting to get some of that coloration, but it could also be an adult female. So females will be various amounts of yellow in the pine warbler, and this can be true of other warblers as well. So you really have to look at other parts of the bird to figure out that this is the same species all the way through. So if you've been studying these 4 pictures while I've been talking, you'll notice that there's one common thing in all 4 birds. And if you look at the wing, you're going to notice there are 2 white wing stripes or wing bars. And that is present in all 4 of those birds. So that is the distinguishing characteristic for a pine warbler, is look for 2 obvious white wing bars or white wing stripes. And that is going to tell you that that is a pine warbler that you're looking at. You can also see in each photo that there's a little bit of a yellow stripe kind of leading from the bill to the eye. It's much more obvious in the 2 birds that aren't quite so yellow. But again, it's sort of a divide, like a little distinct line that you can see in all 4 of those pictures. So again, the more you study these birds and sort of learn these little tips and tricks, the easier it will be. So next we have another species that's probably pretty recognizable for most folks. A lot of us actually provide habitat for them in our yards in the form of bird boxes. And this is our eastern bluebird. So of course, we are responsible for almost wiping them out years ago, but we're also responsible for now having very healthy, stable populations of these birds throughout the United States. So of course, we have our eastern bluebird here on the East Coast. And then on the West Coast, there's a western bluebird, which is very similar. But again, these guys are really in good shape now. We don't have to really worry about providing habitat as much as we used to. But a lot of us still choose to put out bird boxes for species that do nest in dead trees that might have old woodpecker holes or other cavities, because unfortunately, just because of the way that we live, it's really dangerous for us to have dead standing trees, especially near our homes or other structures. So a lot of times the trees that would provide great habitat for these birds get cut down. And so putting out these bird boxes are sort of a good way to make up for that lack of natural habitat. So as you can see in this picture, we have another sexually dimorphic species. So the male is in the center, really brilliant, gorgeous blue color, very dark, obvious orange chest and neck. And then the female is to his right, getting ready to feed the baby with some food. Again, she can be a various shades of blue, but most of the time she's much more muted overall. You can especially see that in her head and kind of her shoulder area. And then on the left, we have our little fledgling bluebird that's probably recently left the nest and is still begging for food. And bluebirds start off being very spotted. So it's a great look at sort of these spotted babies before they start to get their plumage moving into that more standard full coloration. So I wanted to put all of our year-round woodpeckers on one slide because I get a lot of questions. I happen to answer all of the general emails we get at Wake Audubon. And so folks are constantly asking me, hey, I saw this bird and here's a description, what is it? And folks love to ask me what that red and white and black woodpecker that they saw was. And I said, well, you're gonna have to be a whole lot more specific than that. So as you can see, all of our year-round woodpeckers have 3 colors that are in various combinations, and that is that black, white, and red. So I wanted to make sure you could see them all side by side because some are easy to distinguish from one another than others. So we'll start at the far left with our red-bellied woodpecker, which is kind of a misnomer because you can't always see any red on the belly. So what happens is during breeding season, the males get this sort of red pinkish spot on their belly, and it's just something they have as added coloration to attract the female. But what they do have is a red head. And so you can see they have this full sort of cap going all the way down the neck to where it meets that black and white pattern on the back. But if you look over to the bottom right, we already have a woodpecker named the red-headed woodpecker. So I guess they had to go with red-bellied because that was the next best thing. So if you look at the actual red-headed woodpecker, you'll see that it has a very different shade of red on the head and that it is a full red head all the way around. So it's almost like it's wearing a red hood. And then it looks like it's wearing a tuxedo versus all of the other birds because it has this very distinct all white belly, even on the sides, and then this sort of black coat on the back with a white rump patch. So these are very distinct, especially with that different color red. When you see it, there's nothing else that really looks like that in our area. If you notice all of the other 4 pictures, it's almost more of an orangey red color, where that's sort of a really deep ruby red by comparison. So between those 2, the red-headed and red-bellied, we have our pileated, or some folks say pileated. And this is the largest woodpecker we have in the area. I'm originally from Connecticut, and when I moved down here and saw and heard my first pileated woodpecker, it blew my mind because we did not have any woodpeckers nearly that big or loud where I come from. So I was pretty excited to see him. They are probably twice the size as this red-headed woodpecker next to it, if not more so. And they tend to not come to feeders, but they're going to be in areas with a lot of big trees. So if you have a wooded area near you, you have a good chance of having pileated woodpeckers. Red-bellieds tend to come to feeders pretty readily, so you'll see a lot of red-bellieds if you are feeding birds or in an area where other folks might have feeders out. Red-headeds are sort of touch and go with that. They like very specific habitat, so you tend to only find them more in swamps that have standing trees. But I have heard from other folks that I know in the Raleigh area that they get red-headed woodpeckers at their feeders, so you might just be near the right kind of habitat to have these visit you in your yard. And then finally, the 2 that are the most difficult to tell apart are in that top right corner, and this is our downy and hairy woodpecker. So you can see at a quick glance, they look almost identical, but there's one thing I always tell people to look for that's going to let you know whether you're looking at a downy or a hairy, because unfortunately in real life, they're never going to be sitting next to each other, so you can get this nice side-by-side comparison. So what you want to look at is the bills. And if you notice on the hairy woodpecker, the length of the bill is almost equal to the length of the head. So if you look at that, you can kind of see it's basically that same length. If you go to the downy, it's got a much smaller bill, so that bill is not going to be as long as the head. That's what I typically use almost all of the time. You can also get to know their calls, which are fairly different. They do have a little bit of similarity with them, but after a while, especially with the downy being more common in neighborhoods and coming to bird feeders, you'll get to know what they sound like. And they are a little bit smaller overall. And there is a difference in that pattern of black and white spots on the back, but it's really tough to see that at the right angle and be able to distinguish that. So I always tell folks, just look at the bill, and 9 times out of 10, that's going to be all the information you need to tell you whether you're looking at a downy or a hairy. It's always good to pick up little tips like that. So here are our nuthatches. So I like to talk about them right after woodpeckers, because a behavior of woodpeckers is to sort of travel up trees as they look for food. So of course they're drilling to get sap or to get insects under the bark of the trees. And nuthatches are little birds that travel in spirals going down the tree. So one thing I've always wondered is, do nuthatches and woodpeckers ever run into each other when they're kind of traveling in those opposite directions? We can have 3 different species of nuthatches in our area, but 2 are common and 1 is sort of a rare visitor. So the 2 that we see frequently throughout the year are the white-breasted and the brown-headed. So those are the ones on the top. On the top left is our white-breasted. And so this is sort of a blue-gray color overall. It has a darker cap on its head, white belly underneath. So again, white-breasted is a really good name for it. It's describing what the bird looks like. And you can see some little rusty hues towards the back end of it. These are not always obvious, but this is another thing that sort of happens during breeding season where they get a little extra coloration going. And then on the right, we have our brown-headed nuthatch, which is much smaller than the white-breasted, and they are a much lighter gray color with a little bit of brown edging on the wings and a brown head. So again, I love when scientists name things what they look like. It makes it so much easier to remember when you're trying to get to know 50 or 60 or 100 different birds. I know the brown-headed nuthatch is the nuthatch that has the brown head. Check. Something fun about the brown-headed nuthatch is it sounds like a squeaky toy for a baby or a dog. So it has this really high-pitched sort of squeaky, squeaky, squeaky sound that it makes. I'm not even going to try to do it because I can't. But if you go home and squeeze your dog's toy, that's exactly what it sounds like. So listen out for that. They tend to be high up in pine trees, and they are pretty tied to pine trees overall because they use it for their food, their habitat, and their nesting material. So they'll actually take pieces of the bark and also pieces from pine cones and pine seeds and line their nest with those. So they're pretty connected to pine trees overall. So if you don't have pine trees in your area, you may not get to see or hear them. The third nuthatch on the bottom is sort of a special one that we get on occasion. So this is the red-breasted nuthatch. They can be found in North Carolina pretty commonly in the mountains. So they do like higher elevations, and that's more in line with their typical habitat. They're more of a northern species in general. But every once in a while, we have what we call eruptive years, which is IRR. Not ER, like erupting a volcano. Eruptions occur when there's not enough food at their typical sites. So if they're up north and it's a particularly harsh winter and there aren't enough seeds or insects available, species will keep moving south until they reach an area that provides enough food for them to be able to survive. So every so often we get these eruptions of birds coming down, and the red-breasted is one of those species. So sometimes you'll hear birders start to talk about how, oh, this is going to be a red-breasted nuthatch year, and folks will start to see them in the area. So it is possible, but you're much more likely to encounter the white-breasted or the brown-headed. All right, another group of birds that have quite a few species throughout our country are the finches. but they do have some characteristics in common. So if you look again, remember way back when I was talking about the cardinal, they have sort of triangular thick bills, and that's true of finches as well. So one way to kind of determine a finch from a sparrow, because they can both sort of be brown streaky birds, is to look at those bills. So house finches have very triangular bills that are much stouter, and a sparrow has a much more petite bill overall. It's still going to have a little bit of a conical shape to it, but it won't be quite as thick and obvious of a triangle as the finches. So the two species on the top are often confused with one another. House finches are extremely common in our area, and you can see that the male has sort of this orangey red wash over its head and throughout the breast. The female next to it, very similar. You can see they both have a lot of streaking throughout, but she's going to show none of that sort of reddish color. So again, very camouflaged. But if you look to your right, the purple finches, you can see are really similar in a lot of ways. These are nowhere near as common as house finches. And a lot of times, if you report these on things like eBird, someone will say, well, do you have a photo? Are you sure? Because most of the time people are accidentally calling a particularly pretty house finch a purple finch. But if you look closely at the purple finches versus the house finches, on the purple finch, there are these really obvious stripes of black and white, especially on the female. I like looking at the females because to me, it's easier to tell them apart than the males. But you can see that on that female, she has sort of a brown patch on her cheek that goes through her eye. And then there's a white stripe above and below that. And then her head is sort of a brown cap. So it's very distinct black and white stripes. We're looking at the house finch female. There's really none of that. It's sort of one standard kind of brownish color throughout. If you also look at the streaking on the females, on the house finch, it's just complete stripes all the way through, very solid kind of even streaking throughout. On the purple finches, there tends to be a lot more open space in between these individual little stripes. So again, this is a bird that you really need to get to know because purple finches tend to be an eruptive species as well. Or we might see them every winter, but they're going to be very location specific. So for every, 50 to 100 house finches, you might get one purple finch. So a lot of times when folks start out, they're thinking every pretty house finch is a purple finch. And I know I've been 100% guilty of that in the past. Now down below, we have another finch, which is our American goldfinch. And this is one of our really beautiful, brilliant birds that everyone looks forward to seeing every spring. We have them throughout the winter, but once our gardens start to bloom and we start to get all of these seeds going, we can get really big groups of goldfinches moving in. And there's nothing like seeing those beautiful males with that bright sort of yellow lemon color and the black marks on the head and wings and tail. So very distinct color difference there. And then we have the females and immature males, which are going to look more like the one on the right, where there's sort of a brownish, yellowish wash overall. But again, you see those darker wings and tail, just like the male. It's just not quite as obvious a color difference. All right, so this is a group that is very near and dear to my heart. These are our mimics. They are the ones that if you're trying to learn sounds, they're going to mess with you because they can mimic just about any other species, plus cell phones, car alarms, chainsaws, you name it. But you'll notice there's some similarities in all three of these birds. They're in the same family, and so they're going to share some characteristics. They all tend to be very long-bodied and long-tailed birds. So on the top, we have our northern mockingbird, very kind of light gray overall with darker gray wings and a very obvious white patch on the wing as well. And this is even more obvious when it opens its wings and is flying. There's much more white, sort of a block of white in between that darker space. Bottom left is our brown thrasher, very pretty kind of rusty brown color with two white wing bars and lots of streaking along the front. Both of them have yellow eyes. If you notice, both the mockingbird and the brown thrasher, that's a pretty unique characteristic as well. The thrasher is going to be a lot of times on the ground, maybe under shrubs, and you'll hear a lot of kicking around in the leaves. So you might hear some noise of a thrasher and it's not actually calling or singing. It's just sort of kicking around looking for bugs underneath the leaf litter. And then finally, we have the gray catbird, who's a much darker gray color than the mockingbird. You can't really see it well in this picture, but a lot of time it has a rusty patch on its rump on the underside. And then it has a very tiny little black cap on the head. And unlike its relatives, it has a very dark black eye rather than that yellow eye. Another favorite group of mine are the corvids. These are your blue jays and crows. So blue jays are pretty distinct. We don't have any other bird that's going to be quite that colorful and have that many shades of teal and blue. But I like to always point out that sort of black kind of necklace that goes up and around the back of its head. And of course, they can have a peaked head as well if they have their feathers flared out. This one just happens to not be doing that today. And then we have our crow species. So we do have two crow species that are common to our area, the American crow and the fish crow. Very hard to distinguish, especially if they don't make any sound. If you look in most of the bird identification books, it's going to tell you that fish crows are slightly smaller than American crows, which is not helpful at all. So what I've been taught, and I like to pass on to others, is the way you tell between an American crow and a fish crow is you ask it, are you an American crow? And if it goes, it's a fish crow. So if you think of crows, the American crows make that typical sound we think of, which is like a caw, caw, caw. But fish crows tend to sound like they're an American crow with a head cold. So they're very nasally. So they do this sort of like, and they're, So it's just a very different tone in their call. So again, I like that little tip. Just ask it if it's American crow and it'll tell you if it's not. A lot of folks ask about hawks. So we do have several species of hawks in our area, but these are the two sort of biggest and most commonly seen. On the top, we have our red-tailed hawk, which is the largest hawk we have in the area, and it's named for its actual reddish colored tail that you can see really well in the flight picture. Below it, we have our red-shouldered hawk, which does have red shoulders as an adult, but not so much as a juvenile. But as you can see, both of those flight pictures really show off the characteristics that they're known for really well. So I like to include photos of the immatures, which are on the left. And so these juveniles kind of are starting to show some of the patterns of the adults, but aren't quite there yet. So for the red-tailed hawk, if you notice both pictures, the streaking across the breast is very defined. So I like to tell folks that red-tailed hawks look like they have a backpack on. So this is sort of that backpack strap going across their chest. And even as a juvenile, they're going to have it. It's just going to be a little bit more mottled and maybe not as distinct as on the adult. And then with the red-shouldered hawks, they have the streaking that starts from the neck all the way throughout the breast and the stomach. And that same area is going to be all colored in with that sort of rusty tone as adults. So you can kind of see just the streaking pattern on the front of those two juveniles is very different. So again, you're not going to see them sitting side by side, so you may not be able to tell, is that the big one? Is that the smaller one? But that streaking is really going to help you a lot. All right, one of my other favorite groups of birds that get a lot of bad reps are the vultures, but they're actually really beneficial to us and a lot of other animals by cleaning up all of the carcasses that would otherwise be transmitting diseases and a lot of other things too. But we have two species in the area, which are the black vulture and the turkey vulture. They're pretty easy to distinguish whether they're on the side of the road eating a carcass or soaring up in the sky, which is often how people see them. The turkey vulture is a little bit of a longer bird, slightly bigger, and much longer wings. So you can see in the sitting photo, it's got sort of a pinkish reddish head and more brown tones throughout the plumage on the body. And that one on the left is the turkey vulture in the flying picture. So you can see very long wings by comparison, a very obvious tail that extends beyond the feet. And they have the trailing edge of the wings is the lighter part. And in comparison, the black vulture has this grayish head, much smaller, a much deeper black tone overall. And then when in flight, it looks like it has a very stubby, almost no tail when it's in line with the body. And then only the very tips of those outer flight feathers are going to be lighter. So you can see that distinct difference, whether they're way up high or sitting somewhere nearby. Okay, I know that's a lot of birds to take in, but I wanted to cut it off there because I don't want to overwhelm anybody. So hopefully you've seen some familiar faces and also learned some new ones. And before I talk briefly about what Wake Audubon does as an organization, I wanted to let you all know about some birding resources, which I know Morgan has also shared on that page that's connected to this presentation. So two things that I use all the time are apps that are on my phone, but are also available online as well. And that is the Merlin Bird ID app, which is that top app you see, and that screenshot is sort of showing you one way you can use Merlin is if you see a bird, you can actually go through and they'll help you identify what you saw. So they will ask you questions like what size was the bird, what colors was the bird, what was the bird doing, where did you see it? So you can actually put in your zip code or the town that you're in, and it's going to show you pictures of any bird it thinks meets those criteria that you just entered. And most, if not all of the time, your bird is going to be in that group of birds that they offer up as possibilities. So it just depends on how much you were paying attention and how good that information was that you were putting in. eBird is another app that you can use. This will help you find birding locations to go to. You can see what other birders have seen at a specific spot or in your county or general area. And it also allows you to create checklists as you go birding. So you can list the birds that you see and you can start to build your life list or just build out your account to kind of see what birds you've been seeing in your backyard or at your favorite park. And there's just endless possibilities with this app and also their website online. These are both through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And another great part of their website is called All About Birds. So if you want to learn more about any specific species of bird, everything you want to know and more, including fun facts, will be available on that All About Birds website. So those are all fantastic. And if you get to the eBird website, you can basically go to a lot of other components of Cornell's website as well. So you can really nerd out and spend days finding all kinds of cool stuff about birds. All right, so I know I'm running short on time. I'm actually a little bit over. So really briefly, I wanted to share Wake Audubon's mission. So we are your local chapter for Audubon. So we are connected to National Audubon and also Audubon, North Carolina. But our mission as an individual chapter is to foster knowledge, appreciation, and enjoyment of nature, to encourage responsible environmental stewardship, to conserve and restore natural ecosystems, focusing on birds, other wildlife, and their habitats for the benefit of humanity and the Earth's biological diversity. So we have very lofty goals, and you'll notice that we say birds and other wildlife and enjoyment of nature. So we're not just bird people. We have lots of other events and talks about all aspects of nature. But of course, birds are always going to be fairly central to what we do. And below are just some different components of what we do as an organization. A lot of these tie directly into committees that we have. So if you're ever interested in getting more involved in conservation or advocacy, we're certainly always looking for more volunteers and members. But this kind of just gives you a quick snapshot of some of the things that we do. And I wanted to point out specifically our advocacy because there are a lot of different initiatives that as an organization we feel very strongly about, and we try to do our best to influence legislators and the general public to kind of make these priorities as well. So things like our lights out policy for turning lights off for birds during migration. So we have fewer strikes on buildings that can potentially injure or kill birds. Things like clean and sustainable energy. Of course, we have a huge initiative about native plants for wildlife and creating backyard habitats. And of course, we also do a lot of sort of bigger initiatives like the Endangered Species Act and other laws to protect birds, and coastal initiatives. So coastal resiliency, beach nesting birds, and lots of things going on at the coast. And I want to personally invite everybody who's part of this presentation to come and join us. We do a monthly member meeting, but you do not have to be a member to attend. We have it both in person or virtual. So the in-person part is at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in downtown Raleigh. It's the second Tuesday of every month. So if you want to join in tonight, we're going to be talking about the wildlife of India's national parks. So it's really convenient. Since COVID, we decided to go virtual, and we're going to continue that, knowing that not everybody can be there in person. And we've actually been able to reach a lot wider audience by going virtual, which has been great for us. We also offer lots of bird walks throughout Wake County and beyond, and also a monthly field trip that often ties in with our speaker. So one of the links that Morgan has shared with you is our meetup website. So if you join our meetup group, you can RSVP for bird walks and go with a leader who's going to be really knowledgeable and kind of help you continue to learn about birds in person. And I want to throw out there that I am doing a bird walk on Friday at Lake Benson Park in Garner from 8 to 10 a.m. and there are still spaces available. So you can go to the White Deer Park website and be able to register online, and maybe I will see some of you then. So with that, I'm going to see if anybody has questions and stop my screen sharing. So thank you all for listening to me for all that time.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions you want to put in the chat, or you can unmute yourself?
Well, the photos were terrific. So I was wondering where you got the photos.
So yeah, I can't take credit for any of those photos, unfortunately, but I kind of took a variety of some of our local photographers and then other photos that were available for sharing online. Yeah, I try really hard to pick ones that show some of those field marks really well, and sometimes that can be a challenge. We're lucky to have a lot of really great birders that are also photographers, so I let them do all of that. I'm a much better birder than photographer.
Oh, Barbara's got a question. I can't for the life of me remember what kind of bird it was, but there was one that was called red-bellied, but it was actually had a yellow belly. How did it get its name? Oh, that's interesting.
So we do have another woodpecker that's typically here more often in the winter, more common in the winter, which is the yellow-bellied sapsucker. And there's also a northern flicker where we have sort of an eastern and a western version, and the eastern flicker has yellow underneath, but the western has red. So I don't know if that's tying into that at all, but yeah, the yellow-bellied sapsucker and red-bellied woodpecker can sometimes get confusing. And I think there has been some crossbreeding that happens with the flickers. So there are sort of ones in the middle of the country that tend to have orange bellies, which is interesting. So, you know, nature doesn't like to be too easy. They got to throw some, you know, curveballs in there for us. So you're like, wait, that's not yellow or red, it's orange. So yeah.
You didn't mention robins. We're seeing a lot of robins now. I don't know if they're northern bird. I'm from Philly. We used to see robins a lot, but do they come to North Carolina only certain times of the year?
Yeah, so it's funny. I've actually I thought about it this morning when I realized in this specific one I didn't put the robin, but I've had it in other presentations I've done that are similar to this. And so I'm originally from Connecticut and went to school in New Jersey. And so to me, American robins were the first sign of spring. So when I moved to North Carolina and I was seeing them more in the wintertime, it completely threw me off. And I realized, oh boy, I'm going to have to relearn everything I know about birds. So we tend to see much bigger flocks in North Carolina in the wintertime because they're flocked up and this is sort of their overwintering place. So it's probably those same birds that we were seeing back in Philly and Connecticut, but now we're seeing them in their winter time. So they're going to be heading back up there shortly in the spring to kind of be the first sign of spring that we're used to. So yeah, that's what's really fun and amazing about birding in North Carolina is we are lucky to have this temperate climate where we have year-round birds. We're getting a lot of birds that are coming from up north and overwintering with us. and kind of the same thing where we're getting birds sort of on their way through from migration, like from Central and South America. So we just have so many more species. But again, that time of year is so different than what some of us are used to, because we're just now sort of at the other end of their migration journey. And we will see some amount of robins throughout the spring and summer as well. We do have some that nest here, but we tend to just have much bigger numbers, and a lot of them are going to be moving back up north to nest.
Any final questions? Anybody want to share anything?
Yeah, how often are there bird counts? I mean, is that something that it's only a certain time? I know there's a Christmas bird count. I went on a bird count in Fayetteville, the Botanical Gardens, and it was in February. I think it was last February to February before. But I was just wondering if they're just here and there, or if there's regular times when there's bird counts.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there typically tends to be 3 times of the year where bird counts become a big thing. Christmas bird count definitely gets the most publicity. So I think a lot of folks are familiar with hearing about the Christmas bird count. And that's where we're really getting a good look at our winter populations. Then in February, we have what we call the Great Backyard Bird Count, which tends to get a lot of publicity, especially with families and kids. But that's something that you can do right in your own backyard, but a lot of times there'll be advertised walks and group efforts as well. And again, that's sort of getting another good baseline for those winter populations a little bit later into the winter season, before we start to lose some with spring migration and moving out into other places. And then there's sometimes a spring bird count that takes place in April or May. And that tends to be more regional. So I don't see quite as big of an effort, and it doesn't seem as standardized as the others. But there's always what we call a big day of birding, which is almost always in May. And that's like one Saturday that they choose, and you'll probably be able to find it on the Cornell or eBird website. They will advertise one big bird day in May. And that's to kind of get sort of that peak of spring where things are sort of settling into their breeding range. And then you're getting different population numbers as a result of that. Those are the only ones that I've ever participated in and been aware of. There may be others that are more locally specific. But yeah, I would definitely encourage y'all to get involved in, especially the Christmas bird count and Great Backyard Bird Count. There's a lot of great resources online for that. And also you can join with a group of local folks in those Christmas bird counts. And those are throughout the whole state. They're not just around sort of, metropolitan areas. They're actually getting they need more help in some of these more rural, out of the way places. Because of course we can get plenty of people in the Raleigh area to say they want to participate, but there's probably some, north and east and west of us that they're not getting as many folks because they're just not in as populated areas.
I had a question. My bandwidth just went goofy, but I wondered what owls you have in this area. I'm from Illinois, so and we have wooded areas kind of on both sides of my area that we're living.
Yeah, I love your bird feeder setup, by the way. Nice. So the most common ones in our area are the barred owls. I would say that's what people typically hear more than any. I know I have them both at my work location and around my neighborhood. And then we also have a fair number of great horned owls. And we do sometimes get eastern screech owls. So I've heard all 3 of those species in my neighborhood, which I feel pretty lucky about. Screech owls don't seem to be encountered as often. But I know, for example, I have friends that work at Harris Lake County Park out in New Hill, and they have screech owls using their screech owl boxes that they've put out in the park. So they're definitely in our area. I think they don't tend to be as vocal and obvious as those bigger owls do. So the great horned and barred, I think, get more attention and are noticed more. But those 3 are definitely our local species. We do have barn owls in the state, as well as, oh my gosh, it's my favorite owl and I can't think of it at this moment. It's another tiny one. So we do have 2 other species, but barn owls as a whole are really low population numbers. So there's only a few sites within North Carolina that we have confirmation of that species, and people tend to keep them under wraps so that we don't have a lot of folks going out and harassing them. So it's possible to see a barn owl in North Carolina, but you have to work really hard to do so. The northern saw-whet owl is the other one, and that's one that you can probably see in the mountains. There's definitely populations in the mountains, but it's going to be tough to see them anywhere in the Piedmont. There's one that shows up at the Outer Banks all the time at Body Island. So I've seen and heard one out there. But if you ever get a saw-whet owl in your backyard, every birder in the area will be coming to visit you, because that's going to be a big deal.
Yeah, I had a Western tanager at the bird feeder earlier in the year, and I had some people messaging, can I come out and see it?
Oh, yes. Yeah, you will get a lot of...
Yeah, it didn't stick around very long, but
no, but yeah, you'll get a lot of friends if you have an odd bird in your yard. Suddenly you're very popular.
Yeah, I've been trying to connect with some other birders and seeing where the sites are, but I don't see a lot on eBird on some of the local sites. So I'm wondering how many birders that are reporting eBird are around here.
Yeah, I mean, there's also some Facebook groups you can get involved in. There's like a Carolina Birders Facebook group, and if you just look up like birds on Facebook, a lot of times there's some really active groups, and those are nice because a lot of times those get a lot of folks that will post pictures of what they're seeing, and so not only you're seeing, you know, what people are in the area, but also kind of some of the birds that they're starting to notice as well, so you can learn a lot that way.
Oh, great, thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure, yeah.
All right, I'm going to stop the recording now.